Get out. Julian's voice sounded so calm that at first, Claire did not even grasp the meaning of the words. She stood in the middle of the massive living room of their Greenwich estate, her fingers tightly gripping a cup of coffee that had already gone cold, and looked at her husband as if expecting a punchline. But no punchline came. Julian sat in an armchair by the panoramic window, a custom-tailored suit, perfectly styled hair, a gold Rolex on his wrist. He looked like a man straight off the cover of a Wall Street magazine. This was exactly how his partners, investors, and employees saw him. Successful, confident, unshakable. Only Claire knew the other side of this man. "What did you say?" she asked quietly. He looked up. "I said our marriage is over." Silence filled the room. Outside the window, a summer rain was beginning to fall. Drops slowly slid down the glass, as if time had decided to slow down at this precise moment. "Over?" Claire repeated. "Yes, after 15 years. He spoke as if he were discussing the terms of a new corporate merger, without emotion, without regret, without a drop of humanity. Claire slowly set the cup on the marble table. Her fingers were trembling, not from fear, but from profound disappointment. She remembered the day she met Julian. Back then, he had nothing. A beat-up Ford, a cramped rented apartment in Brooklyn. Dreams that were vastly larger than his bank account. She had worked 2 double shifts to pay the rent and keep the lights on. She had supported him when venture capitalists refused to invest a single dime. She had sat beside him late into the night while he drafted business plans. She believed in him when absolutely no one else did. And now, he sat before her, looking at her as if she were an obsolete piece of office equipment. "Is there another woman?" she asked. Julian smirked. "That doesn't matter anymore." That answer was enough. Claire closed her eyes. Something inside her finally snapped. It meant there was. He shrugged. "You are a smart woman. You understand how things are." "Who is she?" "My executive assistant." Claire let out a short laugh. It was bitter, joyless, as if she had just heard a tired, cliché joke. Of course, the assistant. Young, beautiful, ambitious. A classic American corporate cliché. And how long? 6 months. 6 months of lies. 6 months of fake smiles. 6 months of pretending. She felt a wave of agonizing pain rising in her chest. But she had no intention of showing it. Never in front of him. And what now? Julian stood up, walked over to the table, and tossed a manila folder in front of her. "Here are the documents." "What documents?" "The prenuptial agreement." Claire frowned. "What agreement?" "The one you signed many years ago." She opened the folder, turned a few pages, and suddenly felt a sickening chill in her chest. She remembered. She really did remember. Back then, they were just starting to build the startup. A corporate lawyer had brought in a massive stack of paperwork. She had signed everything without reading it because she trusted her husband, unconditionally. According to the agreement, Julian continued calmly, "All assets belong to me." Claire slowly looked up. "What?" "The estate in Connecticut is mine. The company is mine. The offshore accounts are mine." She stared at him, unable to recognize the man standing before her. It was as if a complete stranger had taken his place. "And what am I left with?" "Your personal belongings." For a few seconds, she remained silent, then asked again, "My personal belongings?" "Yes. You signed the documents. I trusted you. That was your mistake." The words hit harder than a physical blow. Claire felt her heart painfully contract, but there were no tears. It was strange. She had expected to cry, to scream, to beg. Instead, a cold, hollow emptiness expanded inside her. "So, you are throwing me out with nothing." "Legally, it is absolutely airtight." "Legally," she whispered the word. "Legally, perhaps. But was it fair?" That was an entirely different question. Within a week, Claire left the estate with 2 suitcases. No scandals, no hysterics, no dramatic scenes. She rented a small, modest apartment in an outer borough of Queens. For the first time in many years, she found herself completely alone. In the evenings, she would sit by the window and watch the streetlights flicker. Her phone remained silent. Most of her so-called high society friends had suddenly vanished. Some stopped replying to text messages, while others pretended to be overwhelmed with charity galas. People are always drawn to power, and Julian held all the power. The financial newspapers continued to publish his photographs. Business networks named him one of the most influential tech entrepreneurs in the country. No one wrote about the woman who had helped him build this empire. No one even remembered her name. Except for one person, One evening, her cell phone rang. Claire looked at the screen. The number was unlisted. She answered, "Hello?" There was a short pause on the other end. Then, a male voice spoke. Deep, calm, and incredibly familiar. "Claire." She froze. Her heart skipped a beat. "Harrison?" "Yes." Claire slowly sank onto the worn sofa. She had not heard this voice in almost 10 years, ever since her younger brother had left the United States to work overseas. "Oh my God," she whispered. "I just found out." "From where?" "It does not matter." A tense edge crept into Harrison's voice. "Is it true?" Claire closed her eyes. "Yes." For several seconds, a heavy silence hung on the line. "He left you with practically nothing, and you did not tell me. You were busy building your life. Do not be ridiculous." She heard her brother take a deep breath before speaking a sentence that made her feel, for the first time in weeks, that she was not alone. "Where is the first court hearing scheduled?" "In 3 weeks. In Manhattan. But Harrison, do not get involved." A short chuckle echoed from the other end of the line. It was not a happy sound. It was dangerous. "I am afraid it is already too late for that." The line went dead. Claire sat motionless for a long time, staring at the dark screen of her phone. She had no idea what her brother was planning. She did not know how much that young man, who had left the country with a single suitcase and massive ambitions, had changed. And she certainly did not know that at this exact moment, Julian was confidently signing yet another lucrative contract in his glass-walled corner office, entirely convinced that the upcoming court hearing would be nothing more than a minor administrative formality. Julian was certain that victory was already in his pocket. After all, he had the best corporate litigators in New York on his side. The laws were on his side, the money was on his side. It never even crossed his mind that in a few weeks, the heavy oak doors of the courtroom would swing open, and a man he had never taken seriously would walk in, changing the expression on the face of every single person present. The morning of the court hearing turned out to be gloomy. The New York skyline was draped in gray clouds, and a heavy humidity hung over the city just before the rain. Claire sat in the corridor of the courthouse, tightly clutching a folder of documents. Beside her sat her attorney, an aging, exhausted man with a habit of constantly pushing his glasses up the bridge of his nose. He had already warned her honestly multiple times. Her chances were incredibly slim. She understood. She understood all too well. The prenuptial agreement was real. The signature was hers. From a legal standpoint, Julian's position looked practically bulletproof. That was exactly why Julian entered the courthouse so confidently. Flanked by 2 high-priced, shark-like attorneys, wearing an impeccably tailored suit, he sported the smug smile of a man who already knew the final score. When his eyes met Claire's, he gave a barely noticeable nod. Not as a former husband, but rather like an acquaintance who happened to end up in the same room by sheer coincidence. She did not respond. She simply looked away. A few minutes later, the bailiff invited everyone inside. The judge took her seat. The proceedings began. The first hour went exactly as Julian had anticipated. His attorneys confidently referenced the documents, the clauses of the agreement, the signatures, the dates, and the statutes of corporate law. Every single argument they made sounded incredibly persuasive. Each subsequent point seemed stronger than the last. Claire felt anxiety rising in her chest. She tried to maintain her composure, but the reality was painfully obvious. The system was designed to crush her. Right at that moment, the heavy double doors of the courtroom unexpectedly swung open. Several people turned around simultaneously. The court clerk looked up with intense annoyance. The judge frowned, preparing to issue a reprimand. But a second later, the expression on her face shifted completely. A tall man in a dark navy suit walked into the room. He was confident, composed, and radiating authority. Behind him trailed 3 others, 2 sharp-looking corporate litigators and a woman carrying a sleek laptop. Claire froze. She recognized her brother instantly, even though he had changed so much over the past decade that most people would have walked right past him on the street. The reckless kid with wild dreams had vanished. In his place stood a man accustomed to commanding thousands of employees. Harrison strode forward with absolute certainty. Whispers began to ripple through the gallery. At first quiet, then growing louder. Someone had clearly recognized him. A reporter in the back row was rapidly scrolling through information on a smartphone. Julian frowned. He stared at Harrison for a few seconds, trying to recall where he had seen that face before. And then, he went pale. Just a little, but it was enough. Claire noticed it, and for the first time in a long time, She felt a profound sense of satisfaction. Her ex-husband had finally stopped looking invincible. Harrison approached the plaintiff's table, calmly placed a stack of documents in front of his lead counsel, and then shifted his gaze to Julian. "Good morning." Julian forced a smile. "Harrison, it has been a long time." Indeed, it has. To an outside observer, their brief exchange might have seemed almost friendly, but the tension between them was physical, like the electric charge in the air right before a lightning strike. The judge demanded order in the court. The hearing resumed. At that moment, one of Harrison's highly paid attorneys stood up. "Your Honor, the plaintiff requests permission to submit supplementary materials into evidence." Julian exchanged a rapid, nervous glance with his legal team. They looked irritated, but still confident. None of them expected any serious surprises. That was, until they saw the contents of the documents. First, the face of Julian's senior attorney dropped. Then the second attorney's expression shifted. Finally, Julian himself read the pages. He quickly flipped through them. Then again. Then a third time, as if praying the text would magically erase itself. But the ink remained. Harrison watched this unfold with complete calm. No arrogant smile, no gloating. He simply observed. "What is the meaning of this?" Julian finally demanded, breaking protocol. "Those are very interesting documents," Harrison replied. "Where did you get these?" "A valide question." Harrison's attorney took the floor, and every passing minute radically altered the atmosphere in the room. It was revealed that many years ago, Julian's tech company had secured its initial life-saving capital through a highly complex chain of investments. On paper, everything looked standard. However, buried in the financial ledgers were details that no one had ever paid attention to before. Details directly tied to Claire. It was entirely due to her personal financial guarantees that the first critical contracts were signed. It was her personal assets that were leveraged as collateral during the startup's most desperate phase. Her direct participation was the only thing that had kept the company out of bankruptcy early on. Years ago, these details seemed like minor technicalities. Now, they were transforming into a devastating legal weapon. Julian kept looking at the papers, less frequently at the judge, and more frequently at Harrison. Irritation flared in his eyes, morphing into anger, and finally, into raw anxiety. Harrison sat perfectly still, as if he had memorized every single word that would be spoken in this room. During a brief recess, Julian abruptly stood up from the defense table and marched straight toward his former brother-in-law. "Did you orchestrate this on purpose?" "Orchestrate what exactly?" "Do not play games with me." "I have never played games. This is family business." Harrison met his gaze without blinking. "That is exactly why I am here. Your sister is a grown woman." "True. She does not need saving." "I am not saving her." "Then why are you doing this?" Harrison tilted his head slightly. "Because I absolutely despise injustice." Julian scoffed. "Really? Just imagine that. You think your money gives you the right to interfere in whatever you please?" This time, Harrison actually smiled. It was a very calm, incredibly cold smile. "That is highly amusing coming from you." For a few tense seconds, total silence reigned between them. Then Harrison added, "Do you know what surprises me the most? That you genuinely believed that after everything she did to build you up, no one would step into the ring to stand beside her." Julian had no response, because at that exact moment, he began to realize a very uncomfortable truth. For years, he had studied his corporate rivals, monitored the stock market, and calculated risk margins, but he had completely neglected to find out who his wife's younger brother had become during the years they were out of touch. In that decade, Harrison had built an international conglomerate worth billions of dollars. And now, this man was sitting across the aisle, not as an emotional relative, but as a ruthless corporate strategist who was entirely accustomed to winning the most brutal wars imaginable. After the recess, the atmosphere in the courtroom had shifted so drastically that even the casual observers in the gallery could feel it. That morning, Julian had looked like the master of the universe. Now, he was frantically whispering with his attorneys. They were flipping aggressively through case files, repeatedly asking the judge for additional time to verify the submitted evidence. Claire watched the unfolding scene with growing astonishment. She knew her brother. At least, she used to know him. But the man sitting just a few feet away from her was entirely different. Harrison did not act on emotion. He was not impulsive. He moved piece by piece, like a grandmaster who had mapped out the entire chess match 20 moves in advance. The judge granted the floor to the plaintiff's side. One of Harrison's attorneys, a young but sharp-eyed litigator, stood up. He began to lay out the facts methodically. No theatrical pacing, no loud declarations. That was exactly what made it so devastatingly effective. Every argument was backed by irrefutable documentation. Every claim was supported by financial trails. Slowly, it became crystal clear that this case was no longer just about a prenuptial agreement. The issue ran much deeper. It was revealed that during the company's fragile startup years, Julian had repeatedly executed critical corporate decisions using power of attorney forms signed by Claire. She had acted as a guarantor. She had provided collateral. She had taken on immense financial liabilities under her own name. On the surface, the corporate structuring made her contributions look secondary. But when the paper trail was connected, the narrative shifted radically. By the time the attorney concluded his presentation, the courtroom was dead silent. Even Julian had stopped trying to project an aura of confidence. He sat and listened, and for the first time in his professional life, he looked like a man who had completely lost control of the narrative. When the hearing adjourned for the day, a swarm of reporters was already waiting on the courthouse steps. The news spread like wildfire. Several major financial networks published photos that very afternoon. The public's attention was not focused on the divorce itself. Everyone was obsessed with Harrison, the elusive CEO of Pinnacle Global Group, who had suddenly descended from the corporate stratosphere to defend his sister. That evening, Julian's phone did not stop ringing. Board members, venture capitalists, and majority shareholders were demanding answers. Some asked cautious questions, others expressed deep concern, and a few outright demanded an emergency board meeting. A reputation on Wall Street takes decades to build, but it can shatter in a matter of days. Julian understood this perfectly. He sat alone in his darkened office, staring at his laptop screen. An article glared back at him. The thumbnail photo showed him walking out of the Supreme Court building. Claire was standing nearby. Just over her shoulder was Harrison. The headline was a nightmare. The hidden history of success. X, wife of tech billionaire, demands recognition for building the empire. Julian slammed the laptop shut. At that exact moment, his office door opened. Chloe walked in, the very assistant for whom he had blown up his marriage. "You are still here?" she asked. "Yes. It is nearly midnight." He rubbed the bridge of his nose, exhausted. "I cannot sleep." Chloe stepped closer. "Is it really that bad?" "Not yet." "Then why do you look like a man who just lost everything?" Julian looked up at her and suddenly realized he did not want to answer. Mostly because he did not know the answer himself. Just a few weeks ago, the plan had been flawless. A clean divorce. A ruthless division of assets. A brand new life. Now, the situation was spiraling entirely out of his control. "This brother of hers," Chloe said quietly. "What is his deal? Who exactly is he?" Julian let out a dark chuckle. "That is the million-dollar question." He unlocked his phone, pulled up the article, and handed it to her. Chloe began to read. At first, her face was neutral, but as her eyes scanned the text, they widened. "Wait." She scrolled down further. "This is the same Harrison?" "Yes." "The CEO of Pinnacle Global Group?" "Yes." "That exact company." "Exactly." Chloe slowly sank into one of the expensive leather visitor chairs. For a few seconds, she was completely speechless. "Why did you never mention this?" "Because I had no idea. How is this even possible? He fell off the map 10 years ago. But this is." She looked back at the screen. The valuation numbers listed in the article were staggering. Subsidiaries in dozens of countries, millions of users, massive global investments, a conglomerate valued in the tens of billions. And all of it belonged to the younger brother of the woman Julian had tried to discard without a dime. Chloe looked up. "I think you severely underestimated him." "I am well aware." Meanwhile, on the opposite side of Manhattan, Harrison was sitting in a penthouse suite of a luxury hotel. The floor-to-ceiling windows offered a breathtaking view of the glowing city skyline. A thick binder sat on the coffee table in front of him. Claire sat on the opposite sofa. "I do not want a war," she said softly. Harrison looked up from his iPad. "Who said there is going to be a war?" "You." "No." Harrison smiled. This time, it was a warm smile. A genuine one, just like when they were kids. "Claire, do you still believe I flew back here just for revenge? Are you not?" "No." She looked at her brother in confusion. "Then why?" Harrison let the silence stretch for a moment before answering. "Because I was not around for far too long. The words were unexpectedly sincere. Claire felt a lump form in her throat. You are not to blame for anything. Maybe that is true, but when I found out what you have been put through these past few years, he shook his head. There are some things a man simply cannot ignore. She looked away, watching the city lights flicker far below. It is still so hard for me to process this. You have become an entirely different person. Harrison laughed softly. So have you. What do you mean? You still have no idea of your own net worth. Claire wanted to argue, but the words died on her tongue. Deep down, she knew he was right. For far too many years, she had lived entirely in the shadow of her husband's towering success. She had treated her own massive sacrifices as if they were just expected duties. She had allowed others to take credit for her genius. Harrison closed the binder. Tomorrow's hearing is going to be much more entertaining. Why? He checked his watch, then glanced at his phone. Because tomorrow morning, someone is going to give an official sworn testimony. Who? Julian's former chief financial officer. Claire frowned. And what does that change? Harrison exhaled slowly. Absolutely everything. You are scaring me. You have nothing to be scared of. Then explain it to me. That old, enigmatic smile returned to his face, the one she remembered from their youth. The smile of a guy who held all the winning cards. Let us just say the documents my team submitted today were merely the tip of the iceberg. A shiver ran down Claire's spine. Harrison, what exactly did you find? He did not answer immediately. He walked over to the glass wall, looked out over the glowing grid of Manhattan, and finally spoke in a hushed tone. I found a man who has spent years keeping a very dangerous secret about how Julian's empire was actually built. And if that man tells the truth under oath tomorrow, the fallout will be infinitely worse than a simple division of marital assets. The next morning, Julian woke up hours before his alarm. He had barely slept. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Harrison's calm, unblinking face in the courtroom. That calmness was what terrified him the most. People who are insecure about winning usually yell and posture. Harrison was different. He spoke quietly, never made threats, and never tried to show off. That was precisely why Julian felt a creeping sense of dread. When Julian arrived at his corporate headquarters, his legal team was already waiting in the boardroom. One look at their faces told him the news was disastrous. The senior partner immediately closed the door and locked it. We need to talk. Speak. The lawyer slid a printed brief across the mahogany table. We ran a deep background check on your former CFO. He has officially agreed to take the stand. Julian scowled. That proves nothing. On its own, no. Then what is the problem? The lawyer hesitated for a few agonizing seconds. The problem is that he did not resign voluntarily. A heavy silence suffocated the room. Julian slowly raised his eyes. What exactly are you implying? According to our internal records, there was a massive conflict between the two of you many years ago. Yes, there was. And if he begins to detail the exact nature of that conflict under cross-examination, this situation is going to become extremely toxic. Julian stood up abruptly, slamming his hands on the table. Toxic for who? The corporation, or for me personally? The lawyer did not answer right away, and that silence was far worse than any spoken confirmation. 2 hours later, the court was back in session. This time, there was standing room only. Journalists packed the gallery, filling every available inch of space. The news of Harrison's devastating legal blitz had turned a standard high society divorce into the most heavily covered corporate scandal in New York. When the former CFO walked through the doors, whispers echoed off the high ceilings. His name was Marcus Thorne, a man in his early 60s, with silver hair and a steady gaze. He displayed zero nervousness, zero fear. He looked like a man who had made his peace with a very difficult decision a long time ago. After Thorne was sworn in, Harrison's attorney approached the podium. Mr. Thorne, how many years were you employed at the defendant's corporation? Nearly 12 years. In what capacity? As the chief financial officer, are you intimately familiar with the financial circumstances surrounding the founding of the company? Yes, very familiar. The courtroom fell dead silent. You could have heard a pin drop on the hardwood floor. Please tell the court, what specific role did Claire play during the initial startup phase of the business? Marcus Thorne looked over at Claire, then shifted his gaze directly to the judge. A foundational one. 2 words, but the impact was seismic. Julian's jaw tightened. His legal team began frantically scribbling on legal pads. Please elaborate. In the early years, the startup was hemorrhaging cash. It was, practically speaking, weeks away from total liquidation. What kept it alive? Capital injection. Whose capital? Thorne paused for a fraction of a second. Claire's capital. Gasps rippled through the gallery. The judge immediately banged her gavel, demanding order. The witness continued. She liquidated her personal inheritance, abandoned her own career trajectory, emptied her savings, and personally co-signed multiple high-risk bank loans. This is fully documented in the original ledgers. Partially documented, the attorney corrected. Why only partially? This time, Thorne stared dead into Julian's eyes, unflinching, because at a later date, many of those financial records were intentionally restructured. Julian shot out of his chair. Objection. On what grounds? The judge snapped. Is this pure speculation? No, Your Honor, Thorne answered with absolute calm. It is an accounting fact. Claire felt her pulse pounding in her ears. She had never heard any of this before. She had no idea what had transpired behind the locked doors of the accounting department all those years ago. The direct examination went on, step by step, ledger by ledger. The financial picture painted was becoming increasingly damning for Julian, but the fatal blow was delivered half an hour later. Mr. Thorne, for what exact reason did you terminate your employment at the company? For the first time, the witness seemed to weigh his words carefully. Because I outright refused to sign off on specific corporate filings. The courtroom held its collective breath. Which filings? The quarterly and annual financial audits. And why did you refuse to authorize them? Because they were mathematically manipulated to hide the truth. Pure, unadulterated rage flashed across Julian's face. Harrison noticed it, but his expression did not change. He just sat back and listened. Are you testifying under oath that the financial audits were deliberately altered? Yes. For what purpose? To legally dilute and erase the equity stakes of specific individuals. Which individuals? Primarily Claire. In the back row, half a dozen reporters began furiously thumbing breaking news alerts into their phones. The bombshell was hitting financial news tickers at that very second. Julian knew it. And he knew something else, too. This trial had officially mutated beyond a domestic dispute. He was now looking at SEC investigations, furious shareholders, and the potential collapse of his entire corporate legacy. During the lunch recess, Julian abandoned his lawyers and marched directly toward Harrison. No fake smiles this time, no corporate pleasantries. What exactly is your endgame here? Harrison looked at him with chilling indifference. Justice. Stop feeding me that self-righteous garbage. Then stop creating environments where justice has to be enforced. Are you trying to annihilate my company? No. Then what the hell is happening in there? Harrison narrowed his eyes slightly. Consequences. Julian's fists clenched. Do you honestly believe you have the moral high ground to judge me? No. Then why are you doing this? Because many years ago, my sister trusted you with her entire life. Neither man spoke for several seconds. And? Julian finally spat out. And you decided to weaponize her loyalty to destroy her. Harrison turned his back. Julian suddenly felt an overwhelming wave of exhaustion. It was a bone-deep fatigue, as if the walls of the courthouse were slowly crushing the oxygen out of his lungs. When the session ended for the day, the press swarmed the exits. Microphones were shoved into faces. Questions were shouted over the chaos. Harrison did not say a single word. Neither did Claire. But that evening, the unthinkable happened. One of Wall Street's largest venture capital funds issued a press release formally suspending all capital investments in Julian's company pending the outcome of the trial. The news broke on Bloomberg within minutes. Share prices began to hemorrhage in after-hours trading. Julian's phone became a relentless nightmare. But this time, no one was calling to offer moral support. Billionaires were demanding explanations, threatening lawsuits, and screaming for collateral guarantees. Near midnight, Julian sat alone in the dark. On his mahogany desk sat a printed transcript of Marcus Thorne's testimony. Right next to it lay another document, a file his panicked legal team had dug up only hours ago. It was a document Julian had completely forgotten about, but one that now possessed the power to ruin him. He slowly turned to the final page, read the bottom lines, and for the first time since the divorce began, he felt genuine, paralyzing terror. Because sitting right there on the signature line was his own handwriting. A signature on an addendum that, a decade ago, had seemed like nothing more than an irrelevant piece of paper. He had brushed it off back then. Now, that single piece of paper legally tethered Claire to a massive block of stock options that he had classified as his sole property. If the judge ruled the document legally binding, Tomorrow's hearing would trigger a financial apocalypse that even his $2,000 an hour lawyers could not stop. The morning began with a crisis. Julian was in the back of his chauffeured SUV, still miles away from the courthouse, when the chairman of his board of directors called his private cell. Men like the chairman never called personally. They had assistants for that. So within the first 3 seconds of the call, Julian knew he was standing on the edge of a cliff. "Julian, we need an emergency board meeting. Today. Immediately after court adjourns." "What is the situation?" A heavy pause came over the line. "The institutional investors are panicking. It is a temporary media circus." "I certainly hope so for your sake." The dial tone echoed before Julian even had a chance to reply. He lowered the phone and stared out the tinted window. Manhattan was waking up, moving at its usual frantic pace. Commuters rushed to the subway. Coffee shops overflowed. The world was spinning on its axis just fine. Only his personal universe was violently tearing itself apart. When his SUV pulled up to the courthouse, the media presence had tripled. Camera flashes blinded him before his feet even hit the pavement. Reporters shouted over one another. "Is it true that hidden contracts prove your ex-wife owns half your company? Will you step down as CEO following the CFO's testimony? Is the SEC preparing an investigation?" Julian pushed through the barricades in dead silence, but he could feel the weight of hundreds of eyes burning into his back. For the first time in his adult life, the spotlight felt like an interrogation lamp. Inside the courtroom, Harrison was already seated. In front of him rested a remarkably thin manila folder. It was incredibly thin. Suspiciously thin. But for some reason, that specific folder radiated pure menace to Julian. The judge called the room to order. After the formalities, Harrison's lead counsel stood up. "Your Honor, today we wish to submit into evidence a supplementary addendum drafted 12 years ago." Julian's stomach plummeted into a freefall. The addendum. He knew exactly what was inside that folder. Claire, watching from the table, saw the exact moment Julian broke. For the first time since the trial began, she did not see irritation or arrogance in her ex-husband's eyes. She saw fear. Primal, unadulterated fear. The bailiff handed the document to the judge, and copies were distributed to the defense. Even though Julian had stared at those exact pages in his dark office the night before, seeing them resting on the judge's bench made them infinitely more lethal. Harrison's attorney began to unpack the legal bomb. Many years ago, when the tech startup was surviving paycheck to paycheck, a secondary contract had been drafted. It explicitly guaranteed Claire financial compensation and equity in the event the company was ever sold or experienced exponential market growth. At the time it was signed, nobody was thinking about billions. The startup was barely keeping the lights on, so the addendum was treated as a throwaway gesture. But there was one massive problem for the defense. At the bottom of the page was Julian's signature, authenticated, verified, and legally notarized. Every sentence the attorney spoke landed like a sledgehammer. The legal implications became terrifyingly clear. If the state Supreme Court recognized this contract as binding, Claire would be legally entitled to an equity block that was no longer measured in the thousands or even the millions. They were talking about a valuation so astronomical it would fundamentally shatter Julian's controlling stake in the empire. Julian stared blankly at the piece of paper, his mind flashing back to the night it was signed. A claustrophobic, poorly lit office. Cheap IKEA desks. Peeling paint on the walls. Claire had been sitting right next to him, smiling, rubbing his shoulders. She truly believed they were going to conquer the world together. He had scrawled his name on the dotted line without even reading the fine print, entirely convinced that they would never end up in a divorce court. Now, that careless arrogance had come back to haunt him with cataclysmic force. During the morning recess, Julian's legal team looked like they were preparing for a funeral. "Give it to me straight. How catastrophic is this?" Julian demanded. Nobody spoke. "I pay you to speak. Talk." The senior partner finally exhaled a shaky breath. "If the judge validates that addendum, our entire defense strategy collapses." "How bad is the damage?" "Fatal." "Be specific." "We are no longer talking about whether Claire walks away with nothing, Julian. We are talking about whether you get to keep control of your own company." A freezing chill settled into Julian's bones. He turned away, staring out the courthouse window. The New York rain was streaking down the glass in long, jagged lines. Suddenly, a memory from 15 years ago slammed into his mind. Claire coming back to their dingy apartment after finishing a double shift. Exhausted, her feet aching, yet she still sat at the kitchen table to help him balance the corporate checkbook. He remembered how she had pawned her late mother's heirloom jewelry to cover payroll, how she had spent hours on the phone begging debt collectors for a grace period, how she had held him when the venture capitalists laughed him out of their offices. The memories kept flooding back, uninvited, relentless. It was as if the ghosts of his past had suddenly shown up to collect on an unpaid debt. Meanwhile, in a private conference room down the hall, Harrison was checking his phone. Claire walked in right behind him. "What is going on out there?" she asked. He looked up. "What do you mean? You look entirely too calm." Harrison smiled. "Is that a bad thing?" "Usually, yes," she sat across from him. "Is there something else you are not telling me?" "Perhaps." Claire frowned. "Harrison, stop speaking in riddles. What is it?" He studied her face for a moment before snapping his laptop shut. "Early this morning, my team received a phone call from someone else. Another witness." "Who?" "Julian's original co-founder. And he wants to testify?" Claire blinked in disbelief. "Why now, after all these years?" "Because for the first time in a decade, he realized there was someone in that courtroom who had the power to make them listen." "What does he know?" Harrison shook his head slowly. "He hasn't given us the full scope yet. But if even half of what he claims is backed by a paper trail, the corruption runs much deeper than anyone on Wall Street ever suspected." A wave of apprehension washed over Claire. "I do not want to destroy his entire life." "Who said anything about destroying him?" "Harrison, look at what is happening." That is exactly what this looks like. Harrison suddenly turned dead serious. The warmth vanished from his eyes. "Claire, sometimes people set off a chain reaction of consequences, and once the fuse is lit, absolutely no one can stop the explosion." She remained silent. She understood what he meant. This trial had long ceased to be just a divorce settlement. It was an excavation. Too many buried secrets were being dragged into the daylight. Too many ruthless decisions were returning to demand payment. The trial resumed after the lunch break. For hours, the attorneys engaged in brutal legal combat. They argued over legal phrasing, contract loopholes, and obscure corporate precedents. But as the afternoon shadows lengthened, something unprecedented happened. The judge looked down at a newly filed motion handed to her by the clerk. After scanning it briefly, she looked up. "The court accepts the petition to call an emergency rebuttal witness to the stand." The gallery erupted into furious whispers. Reporters leaned over the wooden benches, desperate to hear. Julian's brow furrowed in deep confusion. "What witness?" he hissed at his lawyers. The judge adjusted her microphone. "The court calls Mr. Nathaniel Brooks." The name dropped like a live grenade. Julian's face went completely slack. The blood drained from his cheeks. Claire noticed it immediately. Harrison noticed it a split second later. Both of them realized the exact same thing. This man possessed the keys to the kingdom. Because Nathaniel Brooks was not just a former partner. He was the man who had been in the trenches with Julian before the venture capital arrived, before the massive contracts were signed, and before the billions started flowing. If Nathaniel was finally breaking his silence after all these years, his testimony was going to expose chapters of Julian's history that almost no one in that courtroom even knew existed. When Nathaniel Brooks walked into the Supreme Court the next morning, no one could have predicted how violently his presence would derail the narrative. He looked like an ordinary civilian. No bodyguards, no entourage, no display of ridiculous wealth. But the moment he sat in the witness box, the tension in the room spiked to unbearable levels. Julian stared at him as if he were looking at a ghost. A phantom from a past he had spent millions trying to bury forever. After taking the oath, Nathaniel looked up at the judge. Then, he slowly turned his head and locked eyes with Claire. He leaned into the microphone and spoke quietly, but his voice echoed off the marble walls. "Before I answer counsel's questions, there is something I need to state on the record." Absolute silence fell over the gallery. "For all these years, I have lived with the guilt of never thanking the one woman without whom this entire billion-dollar corporation would not exist." Claire's eyes widened. Nathaniel continued. "Everyone in this room thinks they know the legend of Julian's genius. The Wall Street Journal wrote about his brilliant vision. CNBC praised his relentless ambition. Silicon Valley worshipped his risk-taking. But none of those people saw the person who stood behind him when the entire foundation was collapsing." He pointed directly at Claire. "That person is sitting right there." Not a single chair squeaked in the courtroom. "I was there. I watched her pawn her own belongings just so we could make server payments. I watched her work until she was physically ill just to keep the lights on in the office. I watched her abandon every single one of her own dreams to finance his. And later, I watched as her name was systematically and ruthlessly scrubbed from corporate history. Julian lowered his eyes. For the first time since the divorce papers were filed, he looked at the floor. Nathaniel testified for an hour. He spoke without malice, without a dramatic desire for revenge. He simply laid out the cold, hard truth about how the empire was built, who had actually shouldered the catastrophic risks, and who had paid the blood price for every single step toward victory. And the more facts he entered into the court record, the more undeniable the reality became. Claire had never been just the trophy wife of a tech billionaire. She was the architect of his success. When the final arguments concluded, the judge recessed to deliberate. The few days of waiting felt like an eternity for the financial press, for the jittery Wall Street investors, and for the public obsessed with the drama. But no one felt the weight of time more than the people at the center of the storm. Claire barely left her apartment in Queens. Harrison ran his global empire from his hotel suite, but he made sure to check on her constantly. Julian, however, seemed to age 10 years in a matter of days. He locked himself in his penthouse. For the first time in his career, there were no board meetings, no PR spin sessions, no aggressive expansion strategies. He was entirely alone with his own thoughts. And the deeper he retreated into his mind, the clearer a devastating truth became. He had lost this war long before he walked into that courtroom. He hadn't lost when Harrison submitted the financial ledgers. He hadn't lost when the CFO testified. He hadn't lost when his old partner took the stand. He had lost the very moment he decided that the woman who had bled for him during his darkest days was no longer valuable enough to respect. The day the verdict was read arrived sooner than anyone expected. The courtroom was packed beyond fire code limits. People were standing shoulder to shoulder in the aisles. News cameras were positioned outside the courthouse doors, broadcasting live. Everyone was waiting for the kill shot. The judge read her ruling with surgical precision. She listed the facts of the case, evaluated the overwhelming mountain of corporate evidence, analyzed the sworn testimonies, and then delivered a ruling that would rewrite financial history. The court formally recognized Claire's foundational financial contributions as irrefutable. The 12-year-old addendum was ruled legally binding and enforceable. Claire was awarded a massive, equitable share of the corporate assets, stock options, and real estate, along with public, legal recognition of her role as a founding pillar of the business empire. For 3 seconds, nobody moved. Then, the gallery exploded. Reporters scrambled for the exits to break the news. Corporate lawyers began furiously debating the Wall Street fallout. But Claire barely registered the chaos. She sat perfectly still at the plaintiff's table. Tears were silently streaming down her face, not because she was suddenly worth billions, not because she had crushed her ex-husband. She wept because, for the first time in a decade and a half, her story had been heard. Her truth had been validated. Her sacrifices could never be erased or denied again. Harrison leaned over and silently placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. That single gesture was everything she needed. As the crowd began to filter out of the courtroom, Julian unexpectedly walked over to the plaintiff's table. The lawyers around them froze. The remaining reporters held their breath, expecting a screaming match. Julian stopped a few feet away from her. He looked into her eyes for several long seconds, and then, in a voice barely above a whisper, he said, "I am sorry." Claire did not say a word. He swallowed hard and continued. "I convinced myself that all of this success belonged solely to me. I was wrong. I was so incredibly wrong." For the first time since she had met him, his voice held absolutely zero arrogance. There were no calculated excuses, no attempts to spin the narrative, no blame shifting, just profound, crushing regret. Real regret. But there are some things in life that no amount of money can buy back. There are some burned bridges that can never be rebuilt. Claire looked at the man she had once loved more than her own life, and suddenly realized that the heavy, suffocating pain was entirely gone. All that remained was absolute peace. She did not hate him. She did not wish for his ruin. She did not want revenge, because her ultimate victory had nothing to do with his defeat. Her victory was that she had finally remembered who she was. A year later, the business world was caught off guard by a major announcement. Claire launched a massive venture capital foundation based in New York, dedicated exclusively to funding female entrepreneurs. She provided seed money to women who were starting from scratch in their garages, women whose brilliant ideas had been laughed out of boardroom pitches, women who just needed one person to believe in them. Just one chance. Harrison stepped in as the foundation's primary lead investor, and the fund rapidly evolved into a powerhouse organization that permanently altered the trajectory of thousands of American startups. As for Julian, his tech conglomerate barely survived the PR and financial nightmare. He managed to retain a fraction of his company and kept his status in the upper echelons of society. But he emerged as a fundamentally different man, far more cautious, stripped of his God complex, and significantly more human. Sometimes, the most expensive lessons in life cannot be paid for with corporate equity. That was the brutal lesson learned by every single person involved in this war. Because life possesses a terrifyingly perfect sense of timing, it can stay silent for decades. It can allow brutal injustice to thrive in the shadows. It can grant arrogant people the absolute illusion of invincibility. But eventually, the day always comes when the truth kicks open the doors, walking into the room just as confidently as Harrison had walked into that courtroom. And when that exact moment arrives, your bank account, your Wall Street connections, and your corporate power mean absolutely nothing. Only one ultimate question remains. Who were you, deep down, when you thought nobody was watching? Because true, lasting success is never measured by the billions of dollars you accumulated. It is measured by how many people will stand up and speak your name with honor when history finally sits down to tell the truth.